Hey there, Blockhead listeners. Welcome to a new episode. Yes, can you believe it? A new episode at last, at long last, finally. It has been promised to you for quite some time. It is here finally. Part one of a two-part interview with the great Brian Walker. Yes, Brian Walker, the great comics historian and curator, great cartoonist in his own right, son of Mort Walker, writer for High and Lois and Beetle Bailey, and by golly, I could just go on and on. There's so many things that Brian Walker has been involved in the world of comics. So it is really exciting to have him here. It is really exciting just to listen to the interview. I just listened to it again. It's great. Brian has so many stories to tell, and he's been involved on so many levels in comics in the last 40, 50 years. It's just, there's so much to talk about. Not the least of which is the fact that he's part of one of the most famous families in comics, the Walker family, and almost everyone in the family, I think, is involved in Mort Walker's business, one way or the other. For that, we owe Mort Walker a great deal of gratitude. Yes, indeed. So, before we get to that, I guess I'll just tell you a little bit about what I've been doing. I have not been completely remiss in my duties as a Blockhead host, podcast host. I've been really busy. The COVID thing has resulted in a heavy lift, if you will, of courses that were once taught face-to-face, now moving online. And that sounds so much easier than it is. It's not all Zoom meetings and those kinds of things. In fact, most of what I do is not. And so there's a lot of recording, editing, PowerPoint putting together, demonstration creating, you name it. There's a lot of stuff involved. So it has eaten up an enormous amount of my time, and much more than I could have ever imagined. And I just have not been able to get to this until now. So, and even now I'm pushing aside work that I had kind of a deadline for in order to get this out there. But I felt like, hey, this was long promised, and it meant a lot to me, and Brian has waited long enough, and so have you. So, here it is. Anyway, I'll talk to you more at the end. I know you're looking forward to this, and believe me, it does not disappoint. This is part one of a two-part interview with the great Brian Walker. How many times can I say that? But every time it's true. It's really true. So this is a real special thing. So here we go. Brian Walker and myself in conversation.
Yeah, the reason I was asking you about the video is because I've got COVID hair. My hair is like almost put in a ponytail now. So I look like a wild man.
Well, I had Lynn Johnston was on a while ago, and she said, well, this is great. I can do the interview in my PJs. So, there are some benefits to audio only.
Yeah.
Okay. So, welcome, Brian, to Blockhead.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. This is a thrill for me. I'm so excited because you are not only an embodiment of the history of comics and one of the first families of comics, if that is a thing, but also a great historian in your own right. So there's so much to talk about. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure you recall this, but I met you in 2012 at the Billy Ireland Museum, which was just opening up its new facility. And there was a big party. I can't remember exactly what. I think that's what the event was about. It was the opening of the museum.
Right.
And
2013, maybe.
Yeah, maybe it was 2013. That's right.
Yeah. I actually curated the opening exhibit there.
That's right. As a matter of fact, I remember sort of trailing around after you and a group of people who were there, for an appointment to walk through the exhibition with you. I sort of snuck up to that.
Yeah, I had to do two of those that day because it was, you only have so many people that can hear you, and then they start talking in the background. And the gallery tours are always a little challenging, but it's fun to do, actually.
Yeah, and it seemed like a lot of fun, but it was also pretty cool to watch you talk about, the work that was on the wall, and that opening, which was kind of a monumental event, was really a signature event for you, right? The culmination of a year's worth of work with both your dad and yourself on the museum.
Yes, it was. It's kind of an ongoing journey, to tell you the truth. That started in right after I got out of college in 1974. It's hard to believe that was almost 40 years ago, but no, more than 40.
Almost 50.
Yeah, wow. But yeah, I mean, I can speak, as you said before, I have a kind of unique background in that, of course, I'm the son of a well-known cartoonist, and I grew up with a kind of an extended family of cartoonists. So there's a personal kind of family connection. And then, of course, the working at the Museum of Cartoon Art over the years and doing books and exhibits and everything, that's another aspect of my career. And then, of course, working as a professional cartoonist on 2 syndicated comic strips. So, I don't know anybody else that has quite that background and resume.
I think
and whenever
you're alone in that.
Talk to somebody and say, you need to clarify which Brian Walker you're talking to, or which hat I'm supposed to wear at any given point. I mean, I did an interview back in about 2005, I think it was, when I was the curator of the Masters of American Comics exhibit, which opened in LA, and it traveled across the country, and probably one of the more high-profile exhibits I ever worked on. And they set up an interview with Terry Gross and Fresh Air. Mm-hmm. And they were like, the publicity department was, head over heels excited about, like, oh my God, this is so huge, And Terry Gross gets me on immediately, says, what was it like growing up in a household with a working cartoonist? For half the interview, it was about my personal life, and I felt like I wasn't doing my job in promoting the exhibit enough. But it wasn't my fault. I mean, you can't tell Terry Gross to, change the subject or anything. You can still listen to that on iTunes, I think.
Oh, I will definitely search that out. I love Terry Gross, and I'm certain it's a great interview because she's just, the dean or the grande dame of radio interviewers.
Yeah,
I mean,
what a voice! I had his. I was in a NPR station in Connecticut on my way up to go skiing. It was like the day after Christmas or something. And I put these things on, and her voice comes in, okay, well, just relax. I've done my homework. It's going to go easy. And I felt like, like I was talking to my shrink or something,
Hey, that's great, though. That's the best way to get, the best results from an interview, is just to put somebody at ease.
Yeah.
And get into a conversation. So you wear multiple hats, but and hopefully we get to talk to all of those guys in this interview today, because I'm so interested in pretty much everything you do, because there's just so much there. But just continuing to talk about the museum for a little bit. So you started work on that in 1974, but not out of a background in history or anything, or as an art historian or anything. You started off by, your dad asked you to paint the walls, right?
Right. I was a house painter. That was my original qualification. And he had looked at this old mansion around the corner from our home in Greenwich, Connecticut, and said, do you think you could get some of your buddies and clean this place up? I had actually done like an independent study in college on comic art, It was comics as a communicative art form.
Okay.
And it was kind of an independent study, and I'd interviewed Gary Trudeau and Dick Brown and John Cullen Murphy and gone through some of my father's history books and stuff. And so I was just beginning to kind of look at comics a little more seriously because, I'd grown up with, original strips hanging in the walls of our home and in the den and up in my father's studio. And these guys would come by the house, and I just sort of took it for granted. I didn't think about it too much. But after we finished cleaning this mansion up, my father said, well, now we got to put up some exhibits. And I don't know anything about exhibits. I've never worked in a gallery or museum or anything. And and looking back on it, it might not have been the worst thing because we were doing something no one had ever done before, which was create a museum for cartoon art. And so we weren't, all hampered with, museum regulations and things. We kind of just did it on our own. We probably made a lot of mistakes. So we just kind of invented it over the years. And, it was an exciting time. 3 years in 1977, we moved into what was called the Ward Castle in Rybrook. And to me, those were the most exciting years of the museum's history. This funky old castle built in 1870 out of reinforced concrete. And we bought the building for $70,000 and fixed it up and started doing exhibits there. And throughout the 1980s, we did just a series of blockbuster exhibits on the art of Winsor McCay and George Harriman. And we did a lot of exhibits that tied in with movies like Batman and Dick Tracy and Little Orphan Annie. All those movies were coming out in those days. And, in the early 90s, my father got the idea. He was remarried, and there were sort of more ambitious plans for the museum. They wanted to turn it into a world-class institution, and they went looking around, and they ended up in Boca Raton, Florida, with a plot of land down there, and there was no museum. And I told my father, I said, I really don't want to move to Florida. My kids are in school in Connecticut. There's no museum to do any exhibits in anyway at that point. And so I kind of split off in my own direction and started doing exhibits at other museums and doing books and other things like that. It took a little while to get that off the ground, but by the early 2000s, I was just completely swamped with projects and, book projects and exhibits. And
you became kind of an independent curator and expert historian in a way. Freelance. Yeah.
I think that certainly over the years, I've done I think about 75 exhibitions.
Wow.
But I'd done all those exhibits at the museum. I did one after the museum moved at the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport, which was a huge, 100 years of comics retrospective. And then I did another version of that exhibit in Brussels in Belgium.
Oh.
But I think one of the big opportunities that came my way was in 2001. Jay Kennedy, who was the comics editor at King Features, in fact, he was our comics editor, called and said, I met this guy. He's the editor-in-chief at Abrams, and they want to do a book on comic history. Are you interested? And I said, yeah. So I ended up doing the book for Abrams, the comics since 1945, and then ended up doing a second volume. We kind of did it like Star Wars, like backwards, comics before 1945. And I think those two books together, which were ultimately published as a single volume, sort of kind of put the seal of approval on my career as a historian. I think it was, when you do a book like that with a major art publisher like Abrams, I think people notice.
Oh, yeah. And that book is, I've used that book as a textbook in a history of comics class I teach at Adelphi University in Garden City. And fabulous book, absolutely fabulous book. It really covers so much territory and really so in depth. And, I think it's a great achievement. It's for comics, particularly for comic strips, right? It's the only kind of comparison I can make is to H.W. Jansen's History of Art for, the whole history of art, which is fantastic. It's a really great resource, a great book.
Yeah, I appreciate that. When I started that book, I was like, this is an incredible opportunity to do a major book for, probably one of the best art publishers in the world, Abrams. And so I really took the challenge seriously. In fact, each of those books was basically a 2-year project. So I spent total almost 5 years on it. Mm-hmm. And what I did first is, because I have an incredible respect for the people that came before me. many of whom were personal friends, like Bill Blackbeard and Rick Marshall and Ron Goulart and R.C. Harvey. And, I have all their books, and I really studied them. And I said, what's the strength and the weakness of each one of these books? And how can I do it better? How can I improve on what's come before me? And I think one of the biggest things I noticed is the reproduction quality in a lot of those books is not very good.
That's a big point.
And I really, really worked hard to get the best quality. And back in those days, a lot of it they were 4x5 transparencies that I got from everything from the Library of Congress and Illustration House, which is an auction house. And I remember talking with Art Spiegelman, and he said, well, why are you bothering to reproduce everything from original art for the most part? Not everything, but he said, you can just go to the newsprint copies and that have just as good an example. I said, but it's not going to look as good, And my background working on exhibits with original artwork, I have just this incredible respect for the actual original that was drawn by the cartoonist by hand. And to see these things in a museum or in a gallery, they're so beautiful to look at. And they're so much larger for the most part that I wanted to start with that, as a source material, and then reproduce the highest quality I could. And I think we did, Abrams is the kind of company that will follow through and color correct and, back and forth. There was a lot of editing that went on and reshooting of things. And, a lot of, and, somebody wrote a review, like, of course, Abrams has done all their usual quality job, but they could only do as good quality as the source material that I gave them.
Right.
So to me, it was almost like there was a point in while I was working on the book, the Whitney Museum did a centennial exhibit of American art that was in 2 parts. It took up the whole museum. And I said, and there was a catalog. And I said, so I want this book of mine to be the catalog of an exhibit that would be at the Metropolitan Museum or something someday, and that's kind of the approach I took to it.
And it definitely comes across that way. I mean, it really is. At this point, I think your book, for me anyway, I don't know of anything that's come out since, but your book, the collected edition, is really the source. That is the source, the benchmark edition or volume about the history of the comic strip in the United States, particularly, and the images. That's one of the big reasons that I chose to use that one over a variety of others when I was teaching my course, was because the work was just so beautiful, and the writing is great too. So it's altogether it's a really wonderful package. There are a couple of things that crossed my mind, as you were talking, and I was thinking about when you were talking about early on in the history of the museum. Putting together an exhibition is a really daunting task, and particularly, like, I know your dad had a collection of comic art, but it must have been really difficult to cull together, all of these Winsor McKays or whomever, you were doing an exhibition about, particularly like in the 70s and 80s versus today. I think it's more, the collecting of comic art is more visible anyway. There's seems to be a bigger market for it. And so you might be able to find the provenance and find who owns what and track them down. I don't really know the circumstances, but back in the day, it must have been kind of daunting, I would think, to find all of that work and bring it together in one place.
Yeah, sort of like detective work. And still to this day, it's sort of 6 degrees of separation. Like, what happened to this collector that I used to know who died and used to have like 200 Peanut strips, and what happened to that? It was auctioned after he died, and I tracked this. This was for the 50 Years of Peanuts exhibit I did at the museum in Florida. I tracked down this art dealer, Robert Casterline, who had a gallery in, I think, in Aspen and another one in Myrtle Beach or something, and he had all this stuff, and he basically, most of that ended up at the Schultz Museum.
Uh-huh.
But, it's just, I wrote an essay for one of the Billy Ireland catalogs about sort of a history of the museum programs and exhibits. And exhibits sometimes were based upon the source material.
Mm-hmm.
Like Winsor McCay, we knew a guy named Ray Moniz, who was Winsor McCay's grandson, that was the curator of the West Point Museum.
Right.
And he would come down every year and swap out the Winsor McCay that we had in our Hall of Fame. So when I did that exhibit, we borrowed pretty much everything from him. I went up to his house and I looked through trunkfuls of Winsor McCay political cartoons, probably about 30 or 35 original pages.
Oh my gosh.
That family was very sort of gun shy with collectors and people coming in there. And because of my years of knowing Ray Moniz and having him come to the museum, he trusted me. So when we did the Masters of American Comics, of course, Winsor McCay was, the original master, and the opening gallery was all Little Nemo pages, and almost all of them were from the family.
Oh.
But then there are collectors who specialize, like there's one guy who was Matt Masterson. He was the Dick Tracy guy. He had all the best examples and every villain represented in his collection. And
man.
There was a Superman guy and then there were collectors like Murray Harris that started sending letters to cartoonists back in the 1930s. He had a Prince Valiant page from 1939 that Hal Foster had sent him in 1939, and he'd had it ever since.
Oh my gosh!
And Murray had a big collection of Uncle Sam cartoons, political cartoons with Uncle Sam. So we did an Uncle Sam exhibit. So a lot of it was just contacts and connections. Sort of even to this day, I have this sort of web of people that I know that are resource people. They're very generous when loaning for museum collections. I just did probably one of the more important exhibits I've ever curated was a George Harriman exhibit at the Museum Reina Sofia in Madrid, which is one of the biggest modern art museums in the world. That's where Picasso's Guernica lives now.
Oh yeah.
Down the hall, we had a whole huge 4-5 galleries of Harriman Crazy Cat. We had
Picasso loved Harriman.
What's that?
I said Picasso loved Harriman too.
Yeah.
Picasso and Brock both loved Harriman. There are little notes and between the two of them talking about Harriman's Crazy Cat. That's kind of a neat connection.
Yeah. And there was the head of the museum, who lived in New York for a number of years, decided he wanted to do a comic art exhibit, and he thought the Harriman was the likely choice for a one-man show. And they called up to Billy Ireland. They talked to Jenny Robb. Jenny called me, said maybe you should get in touch with these guys, and one thing led to another. And it was just an incredible opportunity for me to do an exhibit in a very high-profile museum like that. But the challenge with the Harriman stuff is there's one guy that has a huge collection of original Crazy Cats who's very uncooperative. I won't name his name, but he just refused to help. So there's a lot of collectors that have one Harriman piece. This is my Crazy Cat. It's usually the pride of their collection.
Sure. Yeah.
So I had to go around to collectors in Italy and Spain and Germany and England and, all around the United States. And, at some point they said, we don't have the budget to pick up 80 different pieces at 80 different locations. So I ended up borrowing over a dozen pages from Gary Trudeau.
Oh, wow. Gary Trudeau?
Yeah, some really nice ones that he bought from the Graham Gallery back in the 1980s. He said it was the best investment he'd ever made.
Yeah, I
back
can imagine.
Buy one for like $800 or $900 or something. They're worth 30, 40, 50 grand now.
Yeah, yeah. It's happening with almost all comics art, right? I mean,
not all, but I mean, Crazy Cats are blue chip.
Well, yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
So it is kind of, each exhibit is a challenge. It's a different challenge. Sometimes there's what I call one-stop shopping, where everything one is in one place, and other times you have to go all over the place looking for things like that.
So do you ever think you'll get tired of the enormous amount of work that goes into putting together exhibitions?
Not really. I really enjoy, once again, I would say about 60% of my time is spent working on the comic strips. I'm writing. I write, about 2/3 of the gags for High and Lois, and about maybe a quarter to half of the gags for Beetle Bailey.
Yeah.
And that's, like for most professional cartoonists, it's solitary work. I have a studio, not in my house. It's about 7 miles away, which is where I am now. So that's, I don't really mind working by myself. In fact, I like working by myself, but occasionally you want to get out and talk to real people instead of imaginary people. And, so I get to go out to the Billy Ireland and work with those wonderful people out there. And we go out to dinner and we have an opening and some cartoonists come, and, it's really, it's like a paid vacation almost.
Yeah, that's great.
When I did the exhibit in Madrid, my wife and I flew over, spent 10 days in Madrid.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And every day I go over to the museum and work pretty hard during the day. And then I meet her and we walk around and go out late dinner. And it was wonderful,
Oh yeah, sure. It sounds great, and it is. It's gratifying. It's exciting. You're also, maintaining the visibility, the history, for people to see, and putting together. These are important exhibitions. Exhibitions like, they can change lives. I know it sounds ridiculous, but when you go into a museum and you're a kid and you're 14 years old, and you're wondering what to do with your life and you like to draw, and then you see a George Harriman up on the wall and a whole host of them and how it all comes together, it just blows your mind, and it makes a big difference. And also I think raising the imprimatur, if you will, of the work over the course of the last 50 years, the respectability of comics has just grown exponentially since the 1970s, and thank goodness, because it's long deserving of the same kind of attention and accolades as any other art form. And
it's got a long way to go, I think. I would like to see one of the big major Museum of Modern Art, or the Whitney, or the Museum of Modern Art, or the Metropolitan do a major comic art show and do it right.
Yeah.
That's, back to what you said earlier. A friend of mine who's now became a friend, Michael Tizaran, who wrote the wonderful biography of George Harriman, Crazy Cat, was inspired to do that book when he went to go see the Masters of American Comics exhibit at the Milwaukee Art Museum back around 2006, I think it was. And he just got so excited by seeing Harriman's artwork that he decided of course, he lives in New Orleans, so there's a local connection there too.
Absolutely, yeah. He's a New Orleans historian, right? I mean,
music writer originally. But there was an exhibit back in the early 90s, I think it was, at the Museum of Modern Art called High and Low.
Yes, I remember that.
And you can imagine where comics was on that spectrum. And a lot of the people in the comics world, including myself, were really angry about the way the sort of disrespected comics in that exhibit, in the way that they were displayed as a sort of a secondary thing that, there was like a romance comic, cheap, in a little glass case, and then a big, huge Roy Lichtenstein painting or something.
Right.
And Art Spiegelman went in there and got so angry that he wrote a scathing review of it in one of the art magazines. And then he gathered together a bunch of curators at his studio in Soho and said, this is the way a legitimate, respectable comic art exhibit could be done. And one of the people at that meeting was Annie Philbin, who eventually became the director of the Hammer Museum in LA. And that's how the whole Masters of American Comics exhibit came to be. It took 10 years for that to get off the ground and actually happen. But it was all a response to, the Museum of Modern Art show.
Yeah, that's really interesting how that grew out of that. And out of, sometimes out of bad things come really good things. And out of our foibles come positive results sometimes.
Yeah.
That was a great exhibition, the Masters of American Comic Art. I saw that at the Jewish Museum, I think, in New York, back when it was out. And, I went several times. I mean, I just loved it. I thought it was fantastic. There was, so much material to take in and so many great pieces and so many great artists to draw from. It was just really mind-blowing, terrific. And I've got
Did you see the other half of the museum? The other half of the exhibit was at the Newark Museum.
Oh, I wasn't able to get to that. At the time I wasn't traveling. I didn't have a car, so I was kind of tied down to Manhattan and Brooklyn, but so I didn't get around to seeing that. I would have loved to have seen that too, because it added, a whole nother dimension, to.
Well, when it was in LA, the Hammer Museum had the first half of the exhibit, which was Winsor McCay to Charles Schultz. And then the second half was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA, which was basically Will Eisner to Gary Panter, I guess you say.
Yeah.
And then when I went to Milwaukee, they combined it all in one museum, the Milwaukee Art Museum, which is an amazing place, designed by Santiago Calatrava, who designed the Transportation Center in Manhattan. Okay. And then when it came to New York, it originally was supposed to go to the Whitney.
Uh-huh.
That didn't happen for one reason or another, and so it got split between the Newark Museum and the Jewish Museum, and Art Spiegelman got so angry that he pulled his art out of the show. Long story, but
I didn't realize that. Yeah,
so the Jewish Museum exhibit was a little bit compromised.
By that, yeah. Well, and I felt at the time too. I mean, no slight on the Jewish Museum, but I felt like that was an exhibition too. I was kind of disappointed that it was split up into two, and I thought, the Whitney is an obvious place for that, and it's really kind of, I don't know, these boundaries that people draw. I don't know where they come from, but comics have had it's been a long struggle, for respectability, and we're still fighting for it, right?
Yeah, no. In Europe, they don't seem to see the distinction between high and low art. To them, comic art is just as important. Harriman is just as important as Picasso. So they don't see. They're working in different mediums and different businesses and everything, but it's still art. They don't make those distinctions the way they do in this country.
Hey listeners, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I hope you're enjoying today's interview. If you are and you want to show support, head on over to my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/Jeff Grogan. At Patreon, you can contribute as little as $1 on a regular basis to ensure the longevity of this podcast. Your support will help keep it not only commercial free, but free to the listening public. And in exchange, you'll get some pretty neat stuff. There are at least 3 different tiers. Each level offers its own distinct rewards. So check it out today at patreon.com/Jeff Grogan, GEOFFGROGAN. Any amount is welcome, and your support is greatly appreciated. Thanks again, and that's patreon.com/Jeff Grogan. Well, I think some of that goes back to the idea that comics in this country, that somehow or another there became this definition or this idea that comics were for kids, and it was children's literature, and that attitude, that viewpoint has really stuck, and it's been all of these years later, even with the advent of graphic novels and et cetera, it's still something that we battle against, that comics are not just for kids, and in fact, I don't know if it's the majority of them, but most of them are written with adults in mind as well as, kids. So I don't know why that is still stuck, but it is still something we're fighting against in this country. And they never had that attitude in Europe or in Japan or elsewhere, where comics are revered. And it's one of those funny things about the West and about the United States that we've been trying to it's like beating your head against a wall. Every time you say that comics are, it's like a new thing. The media picks up this idea, oh, comics are not just for kids anymore. And that's been the case for, however long, as comics
Yeah.
have been around.
And
So
even when I did the Masters of American Comics, I did a lot of interviews, and oftentimes it started off, but why comics in a fine art museum? Why would you do that or something? Or even then, this is the first time that comics have ever been exhibited in a museum, and I say, no, that's not true either. It was just somehow they couldn't get their head around it.
it is.
I did press conference in Madrid, and they had a Spanish translator, and the questions they asked were just so sophisticated, and they weren't at all like, they were so far beyond that question.
Yeah, I think the idea, the comics are in some ways a hybrid art form, which I think in some ways, again, in this country we have a problem with the idea of mixed media, and an art form that it utilizes both verbal and visual skills. It's really hard for at least the way museums are defined and galleries are defined and art is defined here to get our mind around that. But the skills that are required in order to do any form of comics well, whether it's short or long form, are monumental. They're huge. You have to be able to visualize. You have to be able to pace. You have to be able to time it out. You have to be able to write, and you have to be able to edit that writing. And it just blows my mind that one of the things that is always kind of a surprise to students who take comics classes is when you really start to get into it, it's really difficult. It takes a lot of different skills to be working at relatively high levels to make good comics. And I think that's something that people just don't have a grasp on.
Yeah, and I think that the potential for communication is so great. I mean, people can do, you can have a comic strip like Nancy by Ernie Bushmiller, which is on the surface is very simplistic,
Mm-hmm.
And you can have something as sophisticated as, say, Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and everything in between. You can have Prince Valiant, you can have Beetle Bailey, and you can have, Superman, Batman, and that the potential for creativity is almost limitless, really.
It is. And by the way, you mentioned Nancy. Have you read that book, Reading Nancy?
You mean Mark Newgarden and Paul Karasik's book?
Yeah. The
How
whole
to Read Nancy.
Yeah.
That's an interesting story in that in the late 80s, I had done some books with Henry Holt, Reinhardt and Winston, publisher.
Mm-hmm.
And my editor, David Stanford, called me up and said, so United Feature wants to do a book of Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy, which I think they probably wanted to do it for copyright reasons or something.
Yeah.
And David said, and I recommended you to do it. And I said, why? I hate Nancy. Nancy's stupid, it's just for like little kids and grandparents or something. And he said, exactly. That's why I want you to do it. And so I went on this incredible journey of talking to people like Michael Frith, who was the artistic director for Henson Associates, who had Nancy originals all over his office walls.
Oh, my God.
Bill Griffith Zippy, who's actually right now doing a graphic biography of Ernie Bushmiller.
Oh, that's cool.
And Dennis Kitchen, who is the founder of the Bushmiller Society, which we're all members of. We have pins and membership cards, and it's just Tom Gamble, who has the Ernie Bushmiller Cartoon Library and Museum out in California, and it's just grown into this. It's a little tongue in cheek, in that, So when I did that book, I asked. Mark and Paul were, working with Raw Magazine at the time. So they were, I would say, alternative cartoonists.
Right.
And we met in I think it was a Thai restaurant in Greenwich Village, and sat and talked about Nancy for like 3 hours. And David Stanford, my editor, was recording it. He called me the next day. He says, "You're going to kill me." And I said, "What?" He says, I pushed the wrong button. I got nothing.
Oh, no.
None of it was recorded.
Oh
And I
no.
said, oh my God, we were so brilliant. So I went back to Mark and Paul and I said, so could you put that into like maybe an essay or something? So they had a six, I think it was 6 pages in the best of Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy, which was published around 1990. And it just evolved into this. People talked about it and republished it, and I mean, that particular article from my book. And then probably it was like 10 years ago, Mark and Paul called up and said, so we're going to do an entire book for Fantagraphics on how to read Nancy. And I said, oh my God, God bless you guys. They spent years working on that. And it's just sort of like, I mean, I imagine some people think of it as sort of an exercise in futility or excess or whatever. But you look at it, it's just a brilliant book, I think.
It's a brilliant book. It's fascinating, and I'll tell you, it is a textbook for how to, deconstruct and how to reconstruct comics. I mean, if you want to, really find the nuts and bolts of what goes into this art form, boy, that book just lays it all out. And it really makes the case for Ernie Bushmiller as an absolute master of the comics art form, or the comic strip art form. And it's a fabulous book, and I loved it. Although I hesitate to, have my students read it because I'm not sure they'd get through it. But you really have to be obsessive to get into it.
I recommend my book. I don't know if you can still get it, but
sure.
Just as an add-on to that, about a year or so after I did the book, I was still working. It was sort of like the twilight years of the museum and the War Castle. And somebody said, well, why don't you do a Nancy exhibit at the museum? And I said, well, I don't want to make it look like I'm promoting my other outside projects or my book. And they said, oh, come on, this will be great. So I think it was really probably the last great exhibit we did in the Warren Castle in 1990. And a guy Jim Carlson, who was a big help to me on the book, who actually was a neighbor of Ernie Bushmiller's and had a lot of Bushmiller's original art and sketchbooks and letters and photographs and everything. And he gave us money, and we fixed up the second floor, and we put in new carpeting and lighting and everything. And that night we had an opening at the museum that was attended by a mixture of some of Bushmiller's family, which were kind of a bunch of old grannies from Long Island. A lot of the downtown art guys, including Mark Newgarden and Paul Karasik and Art Spiegelman, and Justin Green was there, and Bill Griffith, and then there are all the Connecticut cartoonists like my father and Jerry Dumas and Stan Drake, and it was just, I think it was the best opening we ever had at the museum. It was just
fantastic,
a fun night, and everybody was enjoying the exhibit. And the poster that Dennis Kitchen did for that exhibit is hanging on my wall right to my left here. It's a beautiful poster that was designed by Pete Poplaski of Nancy in an art gallery looking at art.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. It's really great, man. What a great opportunity to bring all of these disparate cartoonists together under one roof. I mean, when it comes to loving comics, there's no boundaries there or definitions that divide people, alternative or mainstream. It doesn't really matter. Right?
Great to turn around and see, some of these downtown art guys talking with Ernie Bushmiller's, great aunt or something. I don't know, but it illustrates a little bit of how these different parts of my career kind of sometimes overlap and intersect, because it's all relating to cartoon art, and whether it's, producing the comic strips, Beetle Bailey and High and Lois, or doing a book or an exhibit or working at a museum or whatever. To me, it's all part of the same ball of wax or whatever.
It makes me wonder then, is this the kind of life you imagined for yourself when you were like a teenager and beginning to imagine a future for Brian Walker, what life would be like or what career you might have? I know you studied something entirely different in college. I think it was African studies or something of that nature. But was getting involved in your father's business something that was in the back of your mind, or was it just came naturally over the course of the years?
No, I don't think so. I think because when I was in school, in junior high school, people knew my connection with my father. So, I drew cartoons for the school newspaper and did posters and always had kind of my own little comic strip projects on the side and stuff. But, I was a child of the 60s, so I was rebelling against my father, who was, as an ex-military man. He was sort of pretty conservative. He voted for Richard Nixon. And, I was a flag-waving radical hippie. I went to Woodstock and, was in the SDS and did civil disobedience demonstrations against the Vietnam War. And my passion was traveling. After my sophomore year in college, I was 20 years old, and I took off with two buddies and spent about 10 months in Africa. Don't get me started, but we started in Europe. We spent 3 months in Morocco. My friend got thrown in jail. We drove across the Sahara. We went through West Africa, then we went to East Africa. At one point, we climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. We ran around in the Gombe Stream Reserve with wild chimpanzees, where Jane Goodall's place is.
Oh, yeah.
We sailed in the Indian Ocean in a dhow. And, one of these days, I want to write a book about it. That's one of my unfulfilled projects in life.
Wow.
And I came back from that, and I was just like, now what?
Yeah, right. It's going to the moon and coming back.
Yeah, it's like the adventure of a lifetime.
Yeah.
And but I continue to travel and still do. My wife and I have traveled back to East Africa on our honeymoon, to Kenya and to Australia and New Zealand and Mexico and Hawaii and Costa Rica. So I've always loved to travel. And I think, when I was that age and thinking about what I was going to do with the rest of my life, I was often in the middle of the Sahara somewhere, really.
Yeah. Thinking about all the places in the world you wanted to go to, rather than working in a studio 5, 6, 7 days a week on a syndicated comic strip. But that's what you're doing now. Your dad has passed away in 2018, right? And now it's really left to you and your brother, Greg, and I don't know who else you have working with you on Beetle Bailey and High and Lois these days, but
my brother Neil, I should say, is now working with us on Beetle Bailey.
Okay, and, so I was just going to say, it must be. Is it? I mean, with your dad having passed, it must be different working on the strips rather, without him around. Did things change a lot? After.
No. Not so much, really. I think, my brother Greg started working with originally on comic books that were published by, was it Charlton that used to do the Beetle Bailey comic books? I think he did Sarge or something. And he started a little earlier than I did, probably late 70s, working and helping my father. And then I actually worked at the museum for almost 10 years before I started working on the comic strips.
Oh, wow.
In the early 80s, my father sold an idea to King Features Syndicate, teaming Betty Boop and Felix the Cat up together in the same strip.
I've heard about that, but I've never seen it.
And he got us, actually there were 4 brothers, my older brother Greg, myself, my brother Morgan, and brother Neil. And we all worked on the Betty Boop strip for about 3 years. It was one of those things that sounded like a good idea. I'm not sure how well it worked. I don't think that King Features ever had a lot of confidence in it. they had some internal problems. They got rid of their East Coast salesman right as the strip launched, so it never had many East Coast papers. The salesman in California was really enthusiastic, so most of our papers were out there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think at some point my father said, "Hey, you're getting pretty good at coming up with gags. What we call gags are the sketches, the storyboards, ideas." And my father has this system where he's got a team of writers. They're dedicated writers. We don't buy stuff through the mail or anything. They're either family members or people like Jerry Dumas who worked with my father for like 60 years. And we each come in with a quota of gags, and we write about 3 times more than we use. And we have a simple grading system. It's either a 1 or a 2. And then you take those gags and sort them up for each strip. And so I started working on about, I think it was about 83, 84, originally writing gags for Beetle Bailey and trying to help him a little bit with the Miss Buxley problem.
Oh, yeah.
He was
Miss Buxley problem.
Yeah. He was attacked for being a sexist. And he said, maybe, you're a young guy, you're liberated, right? You got a young wife. Maybe you can figure this out. And I examined it and I said, well, the first problem is Miss Buxley hardly ever talks. She truly is a sex object. She walks through the room and the general falls out of his chair. And, it's kind of an old-fashioned sense of humor, but it's not really playing so well these days.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually did a book about the whole thing that, I still have boxes in my garage. We tried to sell it to one of the book chains, and the woman buyer said, forget it. Some of those things are pretty funny if you go back and look at it, but
sure, yeah,
it's politically incorrect nowadays.
Well, they're from another era, but another set of ideas, and certainly times have thankfully changed. But yeah, it was part of that world. And what's interesting is the issues that rose up in part in response to it. So, and how you guys dealt with it. So, because Miss Buxley's still an important part of the strip.
Yeah, and I think that readers like her, and so I started writing gags where sometimes she got the punchline, she got the last laugh on the general, and slowly, subtly, we stopped doing, the general's eyes bugging out or oogling her and drooling and stuff like that, And now we've sort of gotten to the point where she and Beetle are kind of special friends, and they do things together, although we don't take it too far, but you come up with new combinations. One of the things that's great about Beetle Bailey, it probably has more characters than any other syndicated comic strip. So you can combine obviously Beetle and Sarge, and then you got Sarge and Lieutenant Fuzz, and then you've got Lieutenant Fuzz and Lieutenant Flap, and then you've got the General and Captain Scabbard and the secretaries in his office and Sergeant Otto, and there's just so many, and you just put those 2 or 3 characters together and just let the sparks fly, see what happens. And that's kind of the way that I won't say the strip writes itself, because it's not that easy, but the hardest thing in Beetle Bailey is to come up with something we haven't done before.
Yeah, after all these years, right?
It's just so many times my brother Greg will say, yeah, we already did that, and we did that last week, or well, this is different, we did it with a cell phone, and it's a different, or and, it's and you're also stuck in between repetitive gags that people like.
Yeah.
It's like, in Peanuts you've got Charlie Brown and Lucy pulling the football away from him, and he used to do that every year.
Sure.
And we've got recurring gags like Sarge hanging off the tree on the edge of the cliff, or Cookie sitting on top of the mess hall sulking, or Beetle sleeping under the tree, or Cookie's meatballs, or and there's always some new twist on that, or some different way to take it, but it can get tough sometimes. In High and Lois, we have situations like Trixie sitting in the sunbeam,
right?
Which is never it's never laugh out loud funny. It's cute, and it's observational humor. It's like this woman wrote one time, I feel like you've been looking in the window of my house. This kind of stuff happens in our family every single day. And I know when Bill Keane died, Family Circus, and he was a good friend of ours, and his son Jeff, who's continuing the strip, is also a good friend. And what Bill Keane taught me is you don't have to be laugh out loud funny every single day. You can be heartwarming. You can pull the heartstrings. I just wrote a high and lowest gag. It's on the drawing board, so it wouldn't run until probably in the fall. But, Chance Brown, who's Dick Brown's son, who's drawn the strip for many years, is a really talented blues guitarist. So I like to do things that have guitars in them. So Chip is also in a band, and they're in a guitar store. And Hi says, "Oh, I used to have a guitar just like that one when I was your age." And the guy that runs the guitar store says, "Man, those are super rare, man. If you still had that, it would be worth a fortune." And they're walking out to the car, and Chip said, "So what did you do with that guitar?" And Chip says, I sold it to buy an engagement ring for your mother. And that's like, oh, isn't that, it's not really funny, but I like those kind of gags.
Sure, yeah, it's great. Well, and that it is the kind of thing that you read, and that definitely touches your heartstrings, makes you think about your own life and whatnot. And I think that was always one of the things about High and Low. Is it was just one of those families that you found people to relate to. Growing up as a kid, I related to Chip, as a teenager, and there's a lightness to High and Lowest that I think makes it really accessible to so many people that I really enjoyed. And it's interesting. I always found it interesting to me personally that I always thought that there was a Mort Walker style, a visual style, and I thought that Dick Brown really sort of took his own approach, but then took stuff from your dad and put those styles together to create a style that was very much in the same mold, of it's just like a whole look, to the comics that came from Mort Walker's imagination.
I did a book also in the 1980s with Holt, The Best of High and Lowest. And in that book, I published some of the early sketches by both Dick and Mort.
Oh, yeah? Oh, wow.
See, Dick at that point was working for Johnstone and Cushing, which was an advertising art agency. And he was doing ads for, Chiquita Banana, the Campbell Soup Kids and stuff like that. And so he had this kind of a little bit more angular, kind of modern advertising style. And then, of course, my father with all the I think R.C. Harvey calls it like balloon-like, anatomy or whatever. Everything's round and
lots of round circles.
They're all round. Bigfoot, classic Connecticut school, we call it. And you can see their original, and then somehow they just blended that together. And Dick kind of adapted his style to Mort's, but kind of eventually it got rounder. In the beginning, it was a little more angular. It kind of reached its peak, I think, in the 60s in terms of the classic Brown era. And he used to do a strip for the Boys Life called the Tracy Twins.
Oh, yeah. I used to love that.
Yeah. And then when Dick passed away in 89, and then Chance started drawing it full time, he'd been helping his dad. And Chance was always like, I'm just trying to channel my dad, trying to like, how would Dick do this? And he had all this reference material and everything. And then probably about 8 years ago, maybe even a little longer, Chance brought in an assistant, Eric Reeves, who used to work for Jim Davis on Garfield and did a lot of product. I mean, Eric can draw any cartoon character. He can draw Snoopy and it looks exactly like Snoopy, and he can draw the princess from Frozen and superheroes and everything. So he's a master at, sort of mimicking styles. So Eric took over. Bit by bit, he started helping Chance originally, but now does all the artwork on High and Lowest, and he does everything digitally now. It's all done on I think it's a Wacom tablet.
Cintiq or
and at first it was a different look. I mean, it was so clean, it almost looked like machine made or something. But he's just gotten really good at drawing the characters. He draws a beautiful Lois. I mean, he's got he puts her in contemporary clothes, and I think he's just doing a great job with it. And he studies Dick's work all the time too. In fact, occasionally he'll just do a swipe, right out of some panel that Dick did back in the mid 60s. That's, he just redoes it, because he has so much respect for Dick's work. I mean, my three favorite cartoonists of all time are Dick Brown, Billy DeBeck, and Robert Crumb.
All three. That's an interesting group.
Yeah, but they're all like scratchy pen and ink guys.
Yeah, very much so. Oh, Billy DeBeck for sure. I just had John Rose on the show a couple of weeks ago, and we talked a little bit about Billy DeBeck. Yeah, and John had done an anniversary drawing for Snuffy Smith in the style of Billy DeBeck, and one in the style of Fred Laswell, and one in his own style. It was kind of interesting, but I love those that, as you said, that scratchy line, pen and ink, man. That's beautiful stuff, and there's a grit to it,
I did an exhibit back in, actually, when the museum first moved. Lucy Caswell in the early 90s called up and said, so we're going to do an exhibit here at the Cartoon Research Library, which is what was forerunner of the Billy Ireland, on the 75 years of Barney Google and Snuffy Smith. And I was wondering if you'd write an essay for the catalog. I said, sure, great. I love DeBeck. It's the one exhibit I never got around to doing at the old museum. Mm-hmm. And everybody said, no, you forget about a catalog. You should do a whole book. So we ended up doing a book, co-published it with Kitchen Sink and Ohio State University Press, and 75 years of Barney Google and Snuffy Smith. And the real joy of that was I got to know Fred Laswell very well.
Oh, you did?
And he said, I don't know what you want from me. You got to come down here to Tampa and spend a couple of days. Tell your daddy you need to do this. And I said, well, my dad's got nothing to do with it. So I flew down and I spent 3 or 4 days with Fred Laswell. I gained about 13 pounds. And that guy was really one of my favorite cartoonists. He was constantly telling jokes, but he was a bright guy. I mean, he was one of the first cartoonists to use computer lettering.
Yes.
He had patents on like harvesting machines, and developed some kind of a form of Braille, and so he was a really bright guy, but he was just this goofy hillbilly, And
that's what John Rose told me about him was exactly that one of the reasons Billy DeBeck hired him was because he came from that kind of rural background, and Billy DeBeck was an urban guy, and so he didn't feel like he had the background to do Snuffy Smith, and so he brought on Fred Laswell. Yeah. And so this is way off topic, but I guess, did you have any chance to talk to Fred Laswell about Billy DeBeck at all, and what he was?
Absolutely. Yeah, he has some great stories. I mean, it actually was a little bit more, circumstantial in that. So Billy DeBeck had a big kind of a mansion in Tampa Bay area. That's where he would spend his winters. And then he had a place in New York City, I think it was on Riverside Drive or something. He was, probably one of the richest cartoonists in the country back in the late 20s or early 30s. Mm-hmm. And he was at a golf tournament, and he saw this sign for the golf tournament that was hand lettered. He said, wow, who did this? He said, some kid, he's like 19 years old. And, Fred grew up on as he used to say, like a dirt farm in Florida. So he really was a kind of a local town guy. And DeBeck says, well, find out who this kid is and send him over. He might be able to help me with the lettering. And this was quite a bit before Snuffy Smith kind of took over. And so Fred became DeBeck's assistant, and he used to come and work with him at the place in Tampa, and then he would come with him to New York City. And, DeBeck would teach him what silverware to use and dress properly. And Fred remembers going to a Yankee game with Babe Ruth's daughter and sitting in the box.
Oh, wow.
Seeing Babe Ruth play in Yankee Stadium.
Oh, my gosh.
And so he had great stories about all that stuff. And, and I can't even do justice to the stories because Fred was a great storyteller.
Okay, did you see what I mean there? Brian's known everybody in the world of comics in the last 50 years or so, and he's got so much stuff, and boy, oh boy, I hope that wet your whistle for the next episode, because there's more to come, and there's more great stories along those lines. And just thinking about that, Fred Laswell and Billy DeBeck, and it was great to talk to John Rose about all of this, and now to hear a little bit more from Brian. It's just, oh man, all this cartooning lore, I just eat it up. what kind of life do I have, right? I mean, oh, really, seriously. I'm here in a closet speaking to myself into a microphone and talking about comics, and I can't. This is the stuff that gets me going, right? God, you think you could come up with something more exciting, for your life, pal, but no. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that episode, and I hope you're looking forward to the next one. And I am going to try to get it out. I'm going to try to sit down later today and edit out the ums and ohs from the next episode and get it to you, like, very quickly, because I've got other stuff I got to get back to work to do. So let's do that, okay? And so, follow me on Instagram, okay? Follow me on Instagram at Grogan Jeff, if I can remember the right gosh darn name. GROGANGEOFF. Yes, I am on Instagram. I am really no place else. That's the only place. So you can find me there on Instagram, and every now and again you'll find me posting something. I haven't been posting on it too much lately, but there it is. You can also follow me on Patreon, of course. Patreon.com, Grogan Jeff, GROGANGEOFF. If you want to throw a little support this podcast's way, it is greatly appreciated. So any amount is very, very helpful, and I thank you very much in advance. So that will do it for this time. I'm going to keep it short. And hopefully we will get that next episode out to you very quickly. We got a 70th anniversary coming up, right? For both Beetle Bailey, right? And also for someone else who I think we all know and love, and that is Charles Schulz and Peanuts. There was a 70th anniversary in October, and we are looking forward to that. And I hope to have a couple of special guests on here to talk some about the great Charles Schulz and Peanuts once again. In the meantime, be well, be safe, wear your mask, stay, do your social distancing thing, and be happy. And, as always, thanks for listening.